The lesser rhythmic hum of the old Singer sewing machine was the only sound cutting through the oppressive silence of the apartment. Eleanor's foot pressed the pedal, a steady, desperate metronome counting down the seconds she had left. 6 months. 6 months since the phone call that shattered her world, the clipped voice explaining a workplace accident. The scent of cheap cotton and machine oil filled her nostrils, a smell she associated with failure. Her fingers, calloused and pricked, guided the fabric under a flickering lamp, the only light. A familiar ache of grief tightened her chest as she glanced at the faded photograph of her husband, his smile a cruel reminder of warmth now gone forever. She could feel the phantom weight of his hand on her shoulder, her stomach twisted with a hunger she had learned to ignore, a dull ache that was nothing compared to the fear coiling in her gut. In the next room, Leo and Sophie slept. Their soft, even breaths were a fragile melody against the machine's harsh rhythm, a sound that both anchored her and threatened to drown her in responsibility. On the small, wobbly kitchen table, next to a stack of half-finished shirts, lay the eviction notice. The paper felt brittle, the red bolded words a violent slash against the cheap page, final notice to vacate. The date was a week away, 1 week to perform a miracle. A wave of nausea rose in her throat, hot and acidic. Next to the notice was her entire fortune. She had counted it a dozen times, as if the act of counting could multiply the worn bills. $100, $150, $180, $200. Exactly. It was the last of the paltry insurance settlement, an amount so small it felt like a final insult to her husband's life, his years of labor reduced to a number that couldn't cover 2 months' rent. She pressed her cold fingers to her temples, the headache a constantly throbbing drum. This wasn't just about her. It was about the gnawing emptiness in her children's bellies. The money was a thin wall between them and the street, a crumbling wall that would be gone in a week. The weight was a physical pressure crushing the air from her lungs. A soft whimper came from the other room, and Eleanor's heart seized. Sophie. She pushed back her chair, the scraping sound loud in the tense quiet, and moved to the small bedroom. Sophie, her 6-year-oldie, was sitting up in the dark, her small form silhouetted by moonlight, filtering through the grimy window. "Mommy, I'm thirsty." The simple request felt like a shard of glass in Eleanor's chest. She forced a smile she didn't feel, her face aching from the effort. "Of course, sweetie." As she got her a glass of water, she felt Sophie's small hand wrap around her fingers, the unconditional trust a heavy, painful weight. On the other side of the room, 10-year-old Leo lay still, facing the wall. She knew he wasn't asleep. He had started doing that after his father died, becoming quiet and watchful, his childhood vanishing under a responsibility he was too young to carry. She could hear his quiet, controlled breathing and felt a fresh wave of guilt. He was trying to be strong for her, trying not to be a burden, and it was breaking her heart. He was a boy trying to fill a void a man had left, and she was a mother failing them both. After Sophie was settled, Eleanor walked back into the main room, and the silence descended, heavier than before. She looked around the cramped space, seeing it not as a home, but as a museum of a dead life. The armchair where her husband used to read to the kids, its fabric worn thin, the crack in the ceiling they always joked about fixing next weekend. Even the incessant drip from the kitchen faucet, a sound that used to annoy her, now sounded like a countdown to doom. A cold wave of absolute hopelessness washed over her, so intense it made her knees weak. Her breath hitched in a silent sob, a raw sound she quickly swallowed. She felt trapped. The city outside, with its millions of lights, was a universe away, indifferent to her struggle. The sewing machine stood silent, a useless monument to her frantic work that was never enough. She felt an urge to scream, to shatter the windows, to break something. Instead, she stood frozen, the despair a thick, suffocating blanket. The future wasn't a blank page. It was a brick wall she was hurtling towards. There was nowhere left to run. She drifted to the bedroom door, her hand resting on the cool wood of the frame. She peered inside, her eyes adjusting to the dark to make out the shapes of her children, curled under thin blankets. Leo and Sophie. They were her everything, her reason for breathing, and her greatest terror. The weight of their futures rested solely on her shoulders, a burden so immense it felt like a stone on her chest. She had to do something, anything, but every path she imagined led to a dead end, to the cold indifference of a shelter or the horror of being separated. There were no family members left to call, no friends with resources to spare. It was just her against a world that had already taken so much. The desperation was a living thing now, a serpent coiling in her gut, whispering of failure. What would you do in her place, with your children's lives hanging by such a thin, fraying thread? If you want to find out how Eleanor fights back from the brink of absolute despair, subscribe to our channel and follow her incredible journey of survival. It was in the dead of the third sleepless night, surrounded by the ghosts of her past and the monsters of her future, that a flicker of an idea, dangerous and insane, took root. Unable to bear the suffocating silence of the apartment, Eleanor had been numbly sorting through a stack of old newspapers, intending to use them to wrap the few dishes she hoped to sell. Her fingers, dry and papery, brushed across a dense block of text in the classified section. Her eyes, blurry with exhaustion, struggled to focus. Public notice. Liquidation of abandoned properties. The words barely registered at first. It was a list of forgotten parcels, of lives interrupted, of debts unpaid. Most were just barren lots or commercial husks, but one line caught her breath. A single, solitary house. It felt like a message in a bottle, a whisper from a world she thought had completely forgotten her. A feeling, not quite hope, but a strange and sudden curiosity, made her lean closer, the scent of old ink and decaying paper filling her nostrils as she read the tiny print. The ad was clinical, devoid of poetry. Property ID 74B, rural dwelling, County of Pocahontas, West Virginia. It detailed decades of unpaid property taxes, a legal ghost that had haunted the county records for half a century. And then, the number that made Eleanor's heart stop and then restart with a painful thud. Sale price, $100. $100. The price was described as symbolic, meant only to cover the administrative costs of transferring the deed. It was a price that screamed of ruin and isolation, a figure so low it was a warning in itself. Yet, to Eleanor, it sounded like a lifeline. $100 was exactly half of everything she had in the world. The risk was monumental, a gamble that could leave them with absolutely nothing, not even the bus fare back to this city that was about to spit them out. Her hand trembled as she placed it over the ad, the cheap newsprint feeling as significant as a holy scripture. A house, a roof. It was a mad, desperate dream, but it was the only one she had left. The internal battle was fierce, a storm of logic against raw, primal fear. The practical side of her, the one that counted every cent and understood the razor-thin margin of their survival, screamed that it was foolish. Throwing away half their money on a sight-unseen property in a state she'd never been to was the act of a person who had already given up. But then she looked at the eviction notice on the table, its red ink like a fresh wound. She heard Sophie's soft sigh in her sleep and saw Leo's tense, worried face in her mind. Staying here was not survival. It was a slow, guaranteed descent into homelessness. This property, this ghost of a house, was not a guarantee of success, but it was a guarantee of a chance. With a resolve that felt like leaping from a cliff, she folded the newspaper, her decision made. The next morning, leaving the children with a neighbor for a single hour, she went to a small, dusty county clerk's office downtown. The transaction was terrifyingly simple. She handed over 10 worn $10 bills, her hand shaking, and in return received a single and folded document, the deed. Telling the children was a delicate operation of weaving hope out of threads of desperation. "We're going on an adventure," Eleanor announced, her voice artificially bright, a performance for an audience of 2. "We're moving to a new house in the country, with lots of trees." Sophie, at 6, clapped her hands, her imagination instantly filling with images of green fields and storybook cottages. Her excitement was a sharp, painful pang in Eleanor's chest. Leo, however, was silent. At 10, he was old enough to see the cracks in their mother's cheerful facade. He watched her pack their life into 2 battered cardboard suitcases and a canvas bag, his eyes full of a quiet, heavy skepticism. He didn't ask about his friends or his school, only practical, somber questions. "Does it have a yard, Mom?" As Eleanor tied the suitcases shut with rough twine, she felt the finality of it. She took one last look around the apartment, a place that had held so much life and now felt like a tomb. The key she left on the counter was a surrender. The click of the door closing behind them was the sound of a world ending. The journey was a descent into a new kind of poverty, one of movement and uncertainty. The bus station was a cacophony of echoing announcements, the smell of diesel fumes, and the low murmur of 100 anxious conversations. Eleanor held her children's hands tightly, the deed and her last $100 a hard, dense weight in her purse. The bus itself was old, the seats vinyl and cracked, the air thick and stagnant. For hours, she watched the familiar grey landscape of the city bleed into the sprawling, anonymous suburbs, and then finally into the deep, unending green of the countryside. The rhythmic groan and shudder of the bus became a strange, unsettling lullaby. Sophie slept curled against her side, her small body warm and trusting, while Leo sat rigidly, staring out the window as small and forgotten towns flashed past like fleeting thoughts. Eleanor's own eyes burned with exhaustion, her mind a frantic loop of prayer and panic. With every mile that passed, the city felt more distant, and her desperate gamble felt more and more terrifying. The sun was high and brutal when the bus driver, a man with a face like a roadmap of the state, called out, "Blackwater Creek Crossing, last stop before the mountains." He jerked a thumb towards the door. This was it. The crossroads was nothing more than a patch of gravel where two cracked asphalt roads met. There was no station, no building, not even a bench, just a rusty, bullet-ridden sign pointing down a narrow lane. Dawson's Hollow, 4 miles. The bus pulled away with a hiss of air brakes and a cloud of black smoke, leaving them in a profound and unnerving silence, broken only by the deafening buzz of cicadas. The heat was a physical presence, radiating up from the road in shimmering waves. Eleanor looked at the meager bags at her feet, then at the long, empty road ahead, then at her children's tired faces. The isolation was immediate and absolute. They were utterly alone. She felt a lump of fear form in her throat, but she swallowed it down. "Well," she said, her voice sounding small in the vast quiet, "looks like we have a little walk ahead of us." The 4-mile walk was a grueling test of endurance. The gravel road crunched under their feet, kicking up clouds of fine, choking dust. There was no shade. The Appalachian sun beat down on them relentlessly, and sweat soaked through Eleanor's thin blouse, plastering it to her skin. Her arms ached from carrying the heaviest bag, its contents rattling with every step. Sophie, after the first mile, began to whimper, her little legs struggling to keep up. Leo, without a word, took his sister's hand, his face set in a grim, determined mask, trying to be the man of the family. Eleanor's heart ached watching him. The world around them was a wall of sound, the incessant, high-pitched song of insects, the occasional caw of a crow, the rustle of unseen things in the dense woods that pressed in on either side of the road. The smell was of hot tar, dry earth, and the sweet, cloying scent of honeysuckle. With each agonizing step, a single question hammered in her head. What will we find? What have I done? She was marching her children toward a promise that could very well be a lie. And then they saw it. Through a break in the trees, perched on a slight rise iron, was the house. And in that single gut-wrenching moment, the last fragile embers of Eleanor's hope were snuffed out. The word house was a kindness it did not deserve. It was a skeleton, a carcass picked clean by time and neglect. A huge section of the roof had caved in, leaving a gaping black wound open to the sky. The windows were not just broken, they were empty sockets, dark and vacant, staring out over the overgrown landscape. The porch sagged tragically to one side, its wooden columns strangled by thick, twisting vines of kudzu that seemed to be actively pulling the structure back into the earth. There was no fence, no path, just a sea of waist-high weeds. The silence here was different from the crossroads. It was heavier, a dead, watchful quiet that seemed to emanate from the ruin itself. This was not a home. This was a grave. The hope that had propelled her for days collapsed, and a cold, heavy dread took its place, sinking like a stone in her stomach. Eleanor's feet slowed, her forward momentum stolen by the devastating reality in front of her. Beside her, she felt Leo and Sophie stop, their small hands clutching at her. The children's silence was more damning than any accusation. With leaden steps, she forced herself forward, pushing through the scratchy weeds that snagged at her clothes. The air grew thicker, cooler, and then the smell hit her. A physical wave of corruption that made her gag. It was the thick, suffocating stench of a place that had been sealed and left to rot from the inside out. Mildew, so pungent it was almost spicy, mixed with the damp, earthy odor of decay and the sharp, sour scent of animal droppings. She placed a hand on the listing porch railing, and the wood felt damp and spongy, crumbling slightly under her fingers. As she stepped onto the porch, a floorboard groaned a long, mournful complaint under her weight. This wasn't the smell of an old, abandoned house. This was the smell of utter and complete ruin, the final exhalation of a dying thing. Her desperate gamble had been lost. She pushed the front door, which wasn't locked. It scraped open on rusted hinges, the sound echoing into the tomb-like interior. The gloom inside was almost total, with only a few weak shafts of dusty light cutting through the darkness from the holes in the roof. As her eyes adjusted, the full scope of the disaster revealed itself, and a wave of nausea rolled through her. The floor was a treacherous landscape of fallen plaster, rotting leaves, and piles of unidentifiable debris. Directly above, a massive hole in the ceiling showed a patch of indifferent blue sky. The floorboards were warped and stained black with water damage, and in the corner, a sickly green fungus climbed the walls like a malevolent garden. A sudden, frantic skittering sound from within the walls made her flinch, a sound that confirmed they were not the only occupants. Her stomach twisted. This wasn't a fixer-upper. This wasn't a project. It was a hazard, a shell. The word uninhabitable was a clinical, insufficient term for this place. It was a monument to failure, and now it was hers. Behind her, a small, choked sob broke the silence. It was Sophie. "Mommy," she whispered, her voice trembling. "This isn't our new house, it's broken." The little girl buried her face in Eleanor's leg, her small body shaking. But it was Leo's reaction that truly shattered what was left of Eleanor's composure. He just stood in the doorway, his face pale, his knuckles white where he gripped a strap of his backpack. He didn't cry. He simply looked from the ruin of a room to his mother's face, and his eyes, the same serious eyes as his father's, held a depth of disappointment that was terrifyingly adult. It was an accusation, a question, and a verdict all in one. In his gaze, Eleanor saw her failure reflected 100 times over. She had promised them a haven, an adventure. Instead, she had led them to a nightmare, trading a crumbling apartment for a literal pile of garbage. She had gambled their last chance and had not just lost, she had obliterated it, leaving them more stranded and more hopeless than ever before. The fragile composure Eleanor had maintained for days, the mask of a capable mother, finally cracked and fell away. A wave of vertigo washed over her as the reality of her decision crashed down with the force of a physical blow. The hope that had been a tiny, flickering flame in her chest was now just cold, dead ash. A hollow, breathless feeling spread from her stomach, making her feel empty and paper-thin. She had done this. Her desperation, her blind, stupid hope, had led them here to this place of decay, miles from civilization, with $100 and 2 terrified children. She had failed. The word was a silent scream in her mind. This wasn't rock bottom. This was a pit beneath rock bottom she hadn't known existed. The weight of her children's futures, which she had tried to carry so bravely, now felt like it was crushing her, grinding her into the dirt of this decrepit, forgotten place. She had promised them a roof over their heads, and all she had given them was a hole to the sky. Moving like a sleepwalker, she drifted from room to room, each one a new chapter in the same story of decay. The kitchen was a horror of rusted metal and peeling linoleum. The iron sink was coated in a thick, orange layer of corrosion. She reached out and mechanically turned one of the faucet handles. It screeched in protest, and a puff of reddish-brown dust and a single dead spider fell into the basin. There was no electricity, the wires having been ripped out or chewed through decades ago, no running water, no bathroom, just a series of dark, empty rooms filled with the ghosts of what they once were, and the pervasive, sickening smell of mold. She looked out a back window, its glass long gone, and saw nothing but a solid, impenetrable wall of trees. The isolation was no longer a concept. It was a physical presence, a cage. There was no neighbor to call for help, no friendly face for miles. They were completely, utterly cut off. The silence of the wilderness was no longer a sound of nature. It was a sound of abandonment. As she stood there, paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of her mistake, she noticed the light beginning to fail. The sun was sinking below the tree line, and the shafts of light cutting through the holes in the house were turning a weak, watery orange. Long, distorted shadows began to stretch across the filthy floors, twisting the piles of debris into menacing, monstrous shapes. A cold evening wind began to pick up, whistling a low, mournful tune as it snaked through the broken windows and the collapsed roof. The sound was like a lament, a song of sorrow for the house and for them. A shiver, not entirely from the cold, ran down Eleanor's spine. The realization hit her with the force of a physical slap. They had nowhere else to go. They couldn't walk back to the crossroads in the dark. They couldn't afford a hotel even if there was one. They were trapped. They would have to spend the night here, in this ruin, in the dark. The thought sent a jolt of pure animal terror through her. Eleanor sank down onto a grimy, splintered step near the front door, the last of her strength gone. She pulled Sophie and Leo close, wrapping her arms around them, trying to shield them from the coming night with her own body. Sophie had cried herself into a state of exhausted quiet, while Leo sat stiffly in his mother's embrace, his gaze fixed on the growing darkness outside. Eleanor held them tight, but she felt a profound, soul-crushing cold that had nothing to do with the evening air. This was the cold of absolute hopelessness. The journey was a waste. The money was gone. The dream was dead. They had traded a slow death in the city for a fast one in the wilderness. Here, in the ruins of a stranger's life, her own life had finally, truly hit its end. The encroaching darkness and the oppressive silence of the forest pressed in, and for the first time, Eleanor didn't just feel alone, she felt erased, a ghost haunting a grave she had dug for her own children. There was nothing left. The first dawn in the house was not a promise, but an illumination of their failure. Eleanor awoke to the sound of a bird chirping from the massive hole in the roof, a cheerful, mocking sound in the dead quiet. A fine layer of cold dew coated everything, making the grime on the floor glisten in the weak morning light. She felt the dampness in her bones, a deep, seeping cold that sleep had not banished. Her body ached from the hard floor, and the knot of dread in her stomach had tightened into a solid, painful lump. Sophie and Leo were still asleep, huddled together under a single thin blanket, their faces pale. The scent of mold and wet earth was even stronger now, a constant reminder of the tomb she had purchased. She felt a familiar prickling behind her eyes, the threat of tears, but she forced it down. Crying was a luxury. Crying wouldn't make a fire or find them food. The survival instinct, battered and bruised, began to stir. It was a faint pulse, but it was there, demanding action over despair. There was only one path forward: work. To surrender to the ruin was to surrender her children's lives. Eleanor got to her feet, her joints groaning in protest. She looked around at the overwhelming chaos and felt a wave of paralysis, but she fought it. She needed a single, achievable goal, one small victory. "We clean," she whispered to herself, the sound of her own voice startling in the silence. It was an absurd notion, like trying to empty the ocean with a thimble, but it was a task. It was something other than sitting and waiting for the end. She decided to start with the cellar. It was underground, and from the outside the foundation looked solid. Perhaps, just perhaps, it was the one part of the house that wasn't open to the elements. If she could clear one small, dry space, they would at least have a shelter from the wind and the coming night's cold. It was a sliver of a plan, born not of hope, but of sheer animal necessity. The cellar door, a heavy plank construction in the kitchen floor, looked ominous and forbidding. Taking a deep breath that filled her lungs with the smell of decay, Eleanor heaved on the thick iron ring set into the cellar door. It lifted with a long, agonizing groan of wood against wood, releasing a blast of cooler, mustier air from below. The air that rose up was thick with the scent of damp soil, stone, and something else, the dry, papery smell of things left undisturbed for a lifetime. A set of steep, stone steps descended into absolute blackness. Her only light was a cheap plastic flashlight she'd bought with a few of her last dollars before leaving the city. She clicked it on, its beam a weak, pale yellow cone, that seemed to be swallowed by the oppressive darkness. A shiver ran down her spine, a primal fear of the unseen places of the earth. She could hear the faint, steady drip, drip, drip of water somewhere in the depths. "Stay here," she told Leo, her voice tight. "I'll be right back." Her heart pounded as she took the first step down, her hand trailing along the cold, slimy stone wall for balance. Leo, however, disobeyed. A few moments after she reached the bottom, his small shadow appeared at the top of the stairs. "I can help, Mom?" His voice was quiet but firm. He wasn't asking for permission. Eleanor's heart twisted with a painful mix of pride and sorrow. He was just a boy, yet he was constantly trying to shoulder a man's burden, his childhood eroding with every crisis they faced. She didn't have the heart to send him back. "Okay," she relented, "but be careful. Watch your step." The cellar was small, with a packed earth floor and stone walls. It was surprisingly dry, aside from the one corner where water seeped through the foundation, creating a dark, muddy patch. The air was cool and still. It was cluttered with the detritus of a forgotten life, rotted wooden crates that crumbled at a touch, rusted metal tools, and piles of damp, indeterminate debris. Together, in the bobbing, uncertain light of the single flashlight, they began the slow, back-breaking work of clearing a space to live. They worked in a shared, somber silence, the only sounds the scrape of wood on earth, and their own ragged breaths. Leo was trying to move a pile of rotted timbers near the base of the massive stone chimney that formed one wall of the cellar. As he tugged at a larger piece, his foot slipped, but instead of just stumbling, his foot went down with a strange, hollow thud that was different from the solid sound of the packed earth elsewhere. The sound cut through the quiet, and Leo let out a small yelp of surprise. "Whoa!" He scrambled back, his eyes wide in the flashlight beam. "Mum, the floor is weird here." Eleanor stopped, her muscles screaming in protest, and moved toward him. The fear that he'd hurt himself was a hot spike in her chest, but he seemed fine, just startled. He pointed a trembling finger at the spot. "Was it moved?" he said, his voice a whisper. "The ground. It moved." The statement hung in the cold, still air, and for the first time, a feeling other than exhaustion or dread began to prickle at Eleanor's mind. Curiosity. Eleanor knelt, aiming the weak flashlight beam at the spot where Leo had stumbled. It wasn't a hole, not exactly. A rectangular section of the floor, about 2 feet long, was sunken slightly. She brushed away the loose dirt and debris with her hands, the gritty soil cold against her fingers. As the patch became clearer, she saw it wasn't earth at all. It was a wooden plank, its surface dark and weathered to look almost exactly like the surrounding ground, but its edges were too perfect, too straight. It had been intentionally cut and placed here. It was a floorboard, where no floorboard should be. Her heart, which had been beating a slow, tired rhythm, began to pick up its pace. This was not an accident. This was deliberate, a secret. The house, which had only offered them misery and decay, suddenly seemed to hold a question. A shiver that had nothing to do with the cold of the cellar traced its way up her spine as she realized this piece of wood had been hidden. "Help me," she said to Leo, her voice barely a whisper. Together, they dug their fingers into the small gap around the edge of the plank. It was heavy and settled deep in the earth, but it wasn't nailed down. With a shared grunt of effort, they pulled. The wood resisted, then shifted with a low groan. Scraping against the stone foundation of the chimney it was nestled against, a puff of dry, ancient dust billowed up, carrying the scent of air that hadn't been disturbed in decades, a smell of pure, unadulterated time. With one final heave, the board came free, landing with a solid thud on the cellar floor. They both leaned over the opening, peering into the small, dark cavity left behind. It was a perfectly formed little hollow, about a foot deep, carved out of the earth. And inside, resting on the dry soil, was something else. It wasn't treasure, not at first glance. It was a small, lumpy package, wrapped carefully in dark, oil-stained cloth. Eleanor felt a tremor in her hands as she reached into the hollow. The air inside the cavity was noticeably drier and warmer than the surrounding cellar. The package was heavier than it looked. The cloth it was wrapped in was stiff and waxy, like old-fashioned oilcloth, designed to repel moisture. It was a deliberate act of preservation. Someone had wanted whatever was inside to last. A powerful sense of trespassing washed over her. the feeling that she was intruding on a secret not meant for her. But that feeling was quickly overwhelmed by a desperate, burning curiosity. What could be so important that someone would go to such lengths to hide it beneath the floor of a cellar in the middle of nowhere? She carried the package to a clearer spot on the floor and knelt, setting the flashlight down so its beam illuminated the object. Leo huddled close, his breathing shallow with anticipation. The small, mysterious bundle seemed to absorb the light, holding its secrets close. Her fingers, clumsy with a mixture of cold and adrenaline, struggled with the wrapping. The waxed cloth was brittle and cracked as she carefully unfolded the corners, the sound loud and sharp in the tomb-like silence of the cellar. Each crackle seemed to be counting down to a revelation. She peeled back the final layer, and the object within was revealed, resting in the center of the dark cloth. It was a key, but it was unlike any modern key she had ever seen. It was huge, nearly 6 inches long, and made of heavy, dark iron, pitted and coated with a thin layer of orange rust. The bow of the key was a simple, unadorned ring, but the bit was complex and intricate, a maze of wards and notches designed for a substantial, old-world lock. She picked it up. The metal was shockingly heavy and cold, a solid, tangible piece of a forgotten past. It felt significant, a tool designed not just to open a door, but to guard a secret. Her mind raced, the weight of the key in her palm a stark contrast to the emptiness of her pockets. A key. The discovery didn't provide an answer. It screamed a new question. A key to what? Eleanor's mind, which for days had been a swamp of despair, was suddenly sharp and clear. This was a puzzle, a purpose. She and Leo looked at each other, their faces illuminated in the single, unsteady beam of the flashlight. His young face was alive with wonder, the heavy burden of their poverty momentarily forgotten. This key didn't fit the front door. She knew that already. Its modern lock was cheap and flimsy. It didn't fit the rotted interior doors, most of which didn't even have locks anymore. So what did it open? A powerful surge of adrenaline, a feeling she hadn't experienced since before her husband's death, coursed through her veins. The crushing weight of their situation hadn't vanished, but it was now joined by a new electric feeling, the thrill of a mystery. This house was no longer just a ruin. It was a treasure map, and she was holding the first piece of the puzzle in her hand. The next few days were a blur of frantic, focused activity. The initial goal of cleaning the cellar was abandoned in favor of a new, all-consuming quest, finding the lock. The search transformed the children. Sophie, seeing her mother and brother energized, forgot her fear and treated it like a grand game of hide-and-seek, her small fingers probing knotholes and loose bricks. Leo became a serious detective, his sharp eyes scanning every inch of the decaying structure. Eleanor led the hunt, the heavy iron key a constant weight in her pocket, a reminder of the secret they were chasing. They tried it on every conceivable lock, the rusted remains of a padlock on a crumbling shed out back, a sea chest in one of the upstairs bedrooms, its wood so rotted it fell apart when they tried to move it. The sound of the large key grating uselessly against smaller, incompatible locks became a familiar soundtrack of frustration, each failure chipping away at the initial excitement. As the second day of searching drew to a close with no success, the familiar chill of despair began to creep back into Eleanor's heart. The sun was setting, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple through the holes in the roof, and the house was growing cold again. She sat on the cellar steps, the heavy key feeling foolish and useless in her hand. Was this another false hope? Had she allowed herself and her children to get swept up in a fantasy, a distraction from the grim reality that they were still trapped, still hungry, still living in a ruin? The hope that had flared so brightly was starting to feel like a cruel joke. Perhaps the lock was long gone, or the key was for something that had been carried away decades ago. She could feel the crushing weight of her failure pressing down on her again, the brief, exhilarating mystery fading into the same old story of desperation. She had led her children on a wild goose chase, wasting precious energy on a ghost. Later that night, unable to sleep, Eleanor sat alone in the silent cellar, the flashlight beam her only companion. The others were asleep upstairs, huddled in the one corner where the roof was mostly intact. She couldn't rest. Her mind kept replaying their search, going over every room, every wall, every piece of rusted junk. Defeated, she let her gaze drift around the cellar, the small beam of light catching the texture of the stone walls, the deep shadows in the corners. Her eyes settled on the chimney. It was the anchor of the house, a massive column of riverstone and dark mortar that rose from the floor and disappeared into the ceiling. An anchor, a foundation. Her tired brain made a sudden leap. People didn't hide things in flimsy places. They hid them in places that would last, in foundations, in fireplaces. Her gaze sharpened, and she stood up, walking slowly toward the chimney, her heart beginning a low, heavy thumping against her ribs. She wasn't just looking at a pile of rocks anymore. She was looking at a hiding place. She ran her hands over the stones at the base of the chimney, the ones level with the floor. The rock was cold, rough, and damp to the touch. She traced the thick lines of mortar with her fingertips, feeling for any irregularity. Most of it was old and crumbling, but then her fingers brushed against something different. Around one particular stone, a dark, squarish block near the floor. The mortar felt harder, smoother. It was a slightly different color, a dark gray instead of the dusty, light gray of the surrounding joints. It looked newer, as if it had been repaired. A jolt went through her. She pressed against the stone with the palm of her hand. It didn't move, but when she pushed harder, leaning her weight into it, she felt it give, a barely perceptible shift, accompanied by the faint grinding sound of stone on stone. Her breath caught in her throat. It was loose. Her shaking fingers had found the seam. This was it. This had to be it. With her heart hammering, she searched the debris for a tool. She found a short, sturdy piece of rebar, its end flattened like a crowbar. She wedged the tip into the thin crack she had made in the mortar and leaned on it. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a loud, grating scrape, the stone broke free from its ancient seal and pivoted inward. Eleanor dropped the rebar and pulled the stone out with her hands. It was heavy, a solid block of granite, and behind it, nestled in the darkness of the cavity, was not a space full of jewels, but something far more subtle. A small, in-round plate of dark iron was set flush into the stone behind where the brick had been, and in the center of that iron plate was a keyhole, its shape an exact match for the complex, intricate key she held in her pocket. It was so cleverly hidden, so perfectly camouflaged in the soot and shadow, that no one would ever find it by chance. A wave of triumphant, terrifying vindication washed over her. Her hands were shaking so violently she could barely hold the key steady. She took a deep, shuddering breath, the dusty air filling her lungs, and brought the key to the lock. The metal felt cold and alive in her hand. She pushed the tip into the keyhole. It slid forward with an impossible, satisfying smoothness, seating itself deep inside the mechanism with a soft, metallic click. It was a perfect fit. The sound was like a confirmation, a whisper from the past telling her she was on the right path. She gripped the cold, circular bow of the key with both hands, her knuckles white. The whole world seemed to shrink to this single point in time, to the connection between this ancient key and this hidden lock. The poverty, the hunger, the despair, it all fell away, replaced by a singular, overwhelming focus. She was about to turn a page that had been sealed for half a century. The anticipation was a physical pain in her chest. She turned the key. It resisted for a moment, and then with a deep, sonorous clunk that echoed in the small cellar, the mechanism turned. It wasn't the sound of a small box opening. It was the sound of a heavy bolt being thrown, a serious latch being released. For a moment, nothing else happened. She pulled the key out and looked at the floor in front of the chimney. She pushed on the flagstones, but they were solid. Confused, her hope began to falter. But then she noticed it. A thin, almost invisible seam in the floor she hadn't seen before, tracing the outline of a large, square section of the stone floor directly at the chimney's base. She hooked her fingers into the groove where she had removed the brick and pulled. The entire section of the floor, a massive stone slab, lifted upward. It was a trapdoor, perfectly counterweighted and disguised as part of the foundation. As it opened, a gust of air rose to meet her, cool and utterly devoid of the cellar's dampness. It was the smell of a sealed tomb, dry dust, aging paper, and a faint, sharp, metallic scent. Leo and Sophie had been woken by the noise and now stood at the top of the cellar stairs, their faces pale and wide-eyed in the gloom. Eleanor barely noticed them. She grabbed the flashlight and aimed its beam down into the darkness. The light revealed a small, square chamber. no more than 4 feet across, lined with meticulously fitted stones. It was an expertly constructed vault, a secret hidden within a secret, and it was not empty. The flashlight beam swept across the floor of the compartment and landed on a neatly arranged collection of objects that made her breath catch in her throat. The space was filled with dozens of small, coarse burlap sacks, tied shut at the neck with twine. They were bulging, filled with something heavy and dense that made them sag. They were stacked with care, a silent, waiting hoard. This was no forgotten stash of heirlooms. This was a treasure, hidden with intent and purpose. She lowered herself down into the cramped space, her feet landing softly on the stone floor. The air was cool and incredibly still. She reached out and touched one of the burlap sacks. It was rough against her skin and shockingly heavy. It was filled with small, hard, round objects. Her mind refused to make the leap, refused to believe what her senses were telling her. With fingers that felt thick and clumsy, she fumbled with the knotted twine on the nearest sack. It wouldn't give. Impatient, she pulled a small, sharp stone from a crack in the wall and sawed at the cord. It snapped. She took a deep, shuddering breath and tilted the bag, pouring a small stream of its contents into her trembling palm. A soft, musical cascade of metal clinking against metal filled the silence. In the weak yellow beam of her flashlight, the objects in her hand gleamed with a deep, soft, unmistakable luster. It was the warm, buttery glow of pure gold, coins, heavy, beautiful, impossible gold coins. Eleanor stared at the gold in her palm, her mind a complete and utter blank. Time seemed to stop. The sound of her own heartbeat was a deafening roar in her ears. These weren't just coins. They were old heavy American gold pieces with eagles and liberty heads, dated from before the 1930s. She dropped them back into the sack, the clinking sound echoing like a gunshot. She opened another sack, and then another. They were all the same, filled to the brim with gold coins. The sheer quantity was staggering, incomprehensible. This wasn't a life savings. It was a fortune, a king's ransom. It was a weight of wealth so immense it felt dangerous. Hot tears of shock and disbelief finally spilled over and ran down her dusty cheeks, tracing clean paths through the grime. All the days of hunger, the nights of terror, the crushing weight of her failure. It all crashed against this single, unbelievable reality. Here, in the dark heart of her ruin, was a salvation so absolute it felt like a hallucination. She ran her hands over the sacks, the coarse burlap and the hard coins within a grounding, physical proof that she wasn't dreaming. This was real. This gold was real. As her hands swept across the bottom layer of the hoard, her fingers brushed against something different, something flat and smooth beneath the lumpy sacks. Her heart gave another jolt. There was more. Carefully, she began to move the heavy bags of gold aside, stacking them against the wall of the compartment. The clinking of the coins was a constant, surreal music. After she had cleared a small space on the stone floor, she saw them. Lying perfectly preserved on the bottom were 2 items. The first was a thick, leather-bound book, its cover dark and unadorned. It was a diary. The second was a sheaf of papers, yellowed with age, bound together by a rubber band that had gone brittle and was cracking apart. They were clearly official documents, covered in dense type and stark, official-looking stamps. With a reverence she didn't know she possessed, Eleanor reached for the diary first. The leather was cool and smooth under her fingers, dry but not yet crumbling. It felt personal, intimate. A palpable sense of history emanated from it, the story of a life sealed away with this incredible fortune. She slowly opened the cover. The pages were filled with a tight, slanted script, written in an ink that had faded from black to a rusty sepia. The first page was dated June 4th, 1952. The words were a torrent of thought and feeling, not just a record of events. She scanned a few lines at random. The pressure is mounting. They are watching the house again. M came by with the last shipment. The weight of this is becoming unbearable, but the cause is just... A cold knot of apprehension formed in her stomach. This was not the journal of a simple farmer. This was the voice of a man in danger, a man hiding more than just gold. She carefully set the diary aside and picked up the stack of documents. They were brittle, and the edges flaked away as she handled them. The rubber band disintegrated into dust in her fingers. The top sheet was a cover page, and the words printed there made the air go cold. In stark, capital letters, it read, Federal Bureau of Investigation, and below that, stamped in faded red ink, was a single, terrifying word, confidential. Her blood ran cold. She slowly leafed through the pages. They were copies of internal memos, surveillance reports, and lists of names. The content was incomprehensible to her, full of jargon and code words, but the implication was clear. This was not just a personal record. This was evidence. This was something the government did not want seen. The gold was a fortune. But these papers felt like a death warrant. Eleanor sat back on the cold stone floor of the secret chamber, the world spinning. The suffocating despair of poverty had been replaced by a new, more terrifying kind of fear. The joy and relief from finding the gold had evaporated, replaced by a chilling understanding. This wasn't a lost treasure. This was a hidden cache, a secret arsenal in a forgotten war. The man who wrote the diary, the man who collected these files, he hadn't just been hiding wealth. He had been hiding from someone, from the people named in these files, from the FBI. The mystery of the key was solved, but it had unlocked a Pandora's box of questions, each one more dangerous than the last. Who was this activist? Why was he smuggling gold for European families? And who was the corrupt official whose name was buried in these confidential reports? The house was no longer a symbol of her despair. It was a crime scene. And by finding this, she had just made herself a witness to a crime someone had killed to keep buried. The cellar's silence was absolute, a dead weight pressing in on Eleanor. The air, thick with the metallic tang of old gold and the papery scent of decay, felt hard to breathe. She ignored the burlap sacks now, their promise of wealth curdling into a threat. Her fingers, stained with dirt and trembling with a new kind of fear, reached for the leather-bound diary. It felt unnervingly alive in her hands, the cool, smooth cover like the skin of a long-dead creature. With a deep, shuddering breath that did little to calm her hammering heart, she opened it. The flashlight's weak yellow beam trembled across the first page, illuminating a tight-a-wee, slanted script that screamed of urgency. The date was stark, June 4th, 1952. The first sentence she read made the hair on her arms stand on end. They are watching the house again. I see their car at the crossroads after dusk. This was not a farmer's journal. This was the record of a man under siege, and she felt a chilling certainty that the siege had never truly ended. She was sitting in his tomb. Her eyes devoured the pages, the flashlight beam her only guide in the suffocating dark. The writer's name was Arthur Vance, no relation she could imagine. He was a poet and a union organizer, and his words bled with a righteous fury that felt centuries old but was rooted in the paranoia of his time. The McCarthy hearings were a constant, shadowy presence in his writing. Blacklisted, he wrote, the word circled multiple times. My friends are disappearing into the maw of the committee. They take your name, then your job, then your freedom. I am a ghost in my own country. Eleanor felt a profound, sorrowful connection to this man. His despair echoed her own, but his was born of ideology and persecution, not just poverty. He was trapped not by a lack of money, but by a surplus of conviction. A chill ran down her spine as she realized the deed to the house carried his name. She had not just bought a property, she had inherited a legacy, a dangerous and unfinished one. It was a legacy written in faded ink. Then came the truth about the gold. A knot of dread tightened in her stomach as she read a passage dated September 1953. Arthur's script was nearly illegible, his hand shaking. The final consignment arrived with the rabbi from Antwerp. The coins feel like tears, each one a life. They are not mine. They are the last remnants of families erased by the Nazi machine, smuggled out to give our own hunted souls a chance at escape. Eleanor's breath hitched. The gold wasn't a criminal's hoard. It was a rescue fund. It was the desperate hope of European refugees, repurposed to save a new generation of American exiles, artists, writers, and thinkers, blacklisted for their beliefs. Arthur was not a thief. He was a conduit, a secret banker for the damned, using this remote house as a waypoint, a hidden station on a modern underground railroad that spirited people to the safety of Canada and Mexico. The weight of the coins, which had felt like a miracle, now felt like a sacred, terrible responsibility that burned her hands. She turned to the sheaf of FBI documents, her fingers fumbling with the brittle, yellowed paper. They were not just random files. They were Arthur's armor. They were meticulously collected copies of surveillance logs, informant payment receipts, and internal memos detailing illegal wiretaps and blackmail operations. It was a detailed map of the corruption festering within the very agencies meant to uphold the law. And then she saw it, a name, recurring across several documents connected to a brutal interrogation of a fellow activist. The name was linked to a young, ambitious field agent known for his ruthlessness. It was a name that Arthur had underlined in red ink, a mark of pure hatred on the page. The name was Thompson. A cold wave washed over her, the name feeling like a curse whispered in the dark. Arthur hadn't just been hiding from the government. He had been building a case against a specific man, a man who had clearly been his personal tormentor. The house was his fortress, the gold his fuel, the papers his sword. Suddenly, a sound from the world above shattered the cellar's ancient silence. It was a sound so alien to this place of decay that it felt like a gunshot, the low, powerful rumble of an expensive car engine growing closer. Her head snapped up, her heart instantly seizing in her chest. No one came down this road. The bus driver had said it was a dead end. Every nerve in her body screamed danger. It was the sound Arthur had written about, the sound of the watchers at the crossroads. But this was no distant observation. This was an arrival. With a surge of pure, primal adrenaline, she scrambled to act. Her mind raced. The gold was too heavy to move, but the diary and the documents were small. They were the story. They were the evidence. With shaking hands, she shoved the leather-bound book and the sheaf of papers deep into the empty canvas bag she'd brought down with her. The engine noise cut out, replaced by an even more terrifying silence. Someone was here. Someone new. Clutching the bag, Eleanor felt a wave of claustrophobia. The secret chamber was no longer a discovery, it was a trap. She climbed out, her body moving with a desperate haste, and carefully lowered the heavy stone trapdoor back into place. It settled with a soft thud. She didn't have time to replace the camouflaging brick. She raced up the cellar steps, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps, her bare feet silent on the stone. She emerged into the main room of the house, blinking in the grey afternoon light. Through one of the gaping window holes, she saw it. Parked right where their lonely path met the overgrown yard was a car. It was a late-model Lincoln, its black paint polished to a mirror sheen, so pristine it looked like a hallucination against the backdrop of rot and ruin. A thin layer of road dust had already begun to settle on its perfect hood, a meeting of two worlds that should never have touched. The sight of it, so clean and powerful, was more menacing than any weapon. It was the vehicle of a predator. Then, the car door opened with a soft, expensive-sounding click. A man emerged. He was elderly, perhaps in his late 70s, with a full head of perfectly groomed white hair. He wore a crisp light grey suit, a stark contrast to Eleanor's own clothes, which were covered in the dirt and grime of the cellar. He moved with a slow, deliberate confidence, leaning slightly on an elegant wooden cane with a silver handle. As he drew closer, she could see his face. It was lined and grandfatherly, and he wore a warm, disarming smile. But his eyes, even from a distance, were a pale, washed-out blue that seemed to hold no warmth at all. They were the eyes of a hawk, scanning the ruin, assessing every broken board and sagging roofline. He stopped a few feet from the collapsing porch, his gaze fixing on Eleanor where she stood frozen in the doorway. He radiated an aura of untouchable authority, the kind of man who owned everything he looked at, and his gaze felt like a physical weight. His smile widened, but it never reached his cold eyes. "Mrs. Eleanor Vance, I presume?" he asked, his voice smooth and cultured, completely out of place in the wild silence of the hollow. The sound of her own name, spoken by this stranger, was a profound shock, a violation. It sent a jolt of ice through her veins. How could he possibly know who she was? Her mind raced, grasping for a logical explanation and finding none. "I'm sorry to intrude," he continued, his tone one of practiced politeness. "My name is Thompson, Marcus Thompson." The name hit her like a physical blow. Thompson, the name from the diary, the name underlined in red. Nausea rose in her throat, hot and acidic. Her hand tightened on the strap of the bag containing the diary. This wasn't a coincidence. This was him, the young, ruthless agent from the files. now standing before her as an old, powerful man. He had come back. He had finally come back for what Arthur had hidden from him. This was the ghost she'd been reading about. Mr. Thompson seemed to sense her shock, but misinterpreted it as fear of a stranger. "Please, don't be alarmed," he said, taking a slow step forward, his expensive leather shoes sinking slightly into the soft, untamed earth. "I'm something of a local figure. I own a good deal of the land in this county, and I make it my business to know my neighbors." He gestured vaguely at the ruin with his cane. "When I heard at the county clerk's office that someone had finally purchased the old Hemlock place, and for such a paltry sum, well, I felt it was my civic duty to come and see if you and your children were all right. This place—" He paused, a look of faux sadness on his face. "It has a very troubled history. A lot of sad stories are buried here." The words were layered with a hidden meaning that made Eleanor's blood run cold. He wasn't talking about the house. He was talking about Arthur, and he was testing her, waiting to see if she knew he was the one who had buried him. The air grew thick with unspoken words. He took another step closer, his gaze now fixed directly on her, sharp and appraising. Eleanor felt pinned by his stare, like an insect under glass. She could smell the faint, clean scent of his expensive cologne, a smell of money and power that was an offense in this place of poverty and decay. "Frankly, Mrs. Vance, this place is no home for a woman and her children. It's a death trap," he said, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "I am, among other things, a real estate developer. I have a long-standing interest in consolidating the land in this valley for a new project." He paused, letting the implication hang in the air. "I am prepared to offer you $20,000, cash, for the deed. Think of it as a charitable gesture. A way for you to take your children and find a proper home, a fresh start, far away from all this rot and misery." The number hung in the air, glittering and impossibly large. $20,000. It was a fortune. It was an escape. It was the easy way out. The figure, $20,000, echoed in the desperate, empty spaces of Eleanor's mind. It was a lifeline, a clean one. She could take that money, pack up her children, and disappear. They could have a small, clean apartment, food on the table, new clothes. Leo and Sophie could go to a real school. She could buy a new sewing machine. The vision was so powerful, so seductive, it almost buckled her knees. It was a straight, easy path out of the hell she was in. All she had to do was say yes. All she had to do was sign a piece of paper, walk away, and forget. Forget the key. Forget the cellar. Forget the gold. Forget the haunted words of Arthur Vance. A powerful, logical part of her brain screamed at her to take the deal. It was the sensible choice, the mother's choice. To protect her children, she should take the money and run, leaving the ghosts of this place to their secrets. It was the price of her family's safety, but she couldn't speak. The word, yes, was a fishbone caught in her throat. She looked past Thompson, at the ruin of a house behind him. It was a grave. It was a tomb, but it was also a testament. She thought of Arthur Vance, writing furiously by candlelight, hunted and alone, protecting a treasure that wasn't his for a cause he believed in. She thought of the names in the FBI files, the lives destroyed by the man standing in front of her. The weight of the diary in the bag on her shoulder felt immense, a physical anchor holding her in place. How could she sell this man the very ground where his victim lay buried? How could she let him finally win? Let him pave over this history with his new project? A flicker of defiance, foreign and terrifying, sparked within her. It wasn't her fight, but she had stumbled into the trenches. Her hesitation was only for a second, but in the charged silence, a second was an eternity. She simply stared at him, her silence her only answer, and in that moment of hesitation, the mask slipped. The transformation was subtle, but absolute. The grandfatherly warmth in Mr. Thompson's face didn't just fade, it evaporated, as if it had never been there. The muscles around his mouth tightened, pulling his benevolent smile into a thin, bloodless line. The skin around his eyes crinkled, but not with kindness. It was the predatory narrowing of a hawk that has spotted a weakness in its prey. The pale blue of his irises seemed to flash, hardening into chips of glacial ice. He was no longer performing. The practiced charm, the civic concern, the philanthropic air, it all dissolved, revealing the unadorned, brutal core of the man beneath. The man from the files. The man with the capacity for cruelty. Eleanor felt a sudden visceral drop in temperature, though the air had not changed. She was no longer speaking to a respected real estate mogul. She was facing a killer, and he knew that she knew. The game was over. He took a step closer, invading her personal space. The smell of his cologne was now cloying, suffocating. He lowered his voice, forcing her to lean in to hear him. The smooth, cultured tone was gone, replaced by a low, gravelly whisper that was pure menace. "It's a very generous offer, Mrs. Vance," he purred. The sound like sandpaper on silk. "A real shame if something were to happen to this property before you could accept it." He tapped his silver-handled cane lightly on a rotting porch step. The sound a sharp, definitive rap in the quiet. He looked from the house to her children, who were now peeking out from behind her legs. Abandoned properties like this, out in the middle of nowhere. He let the sentence hang, then finished it with chilling casualness. "They have a way of catching fire by accident. Terrible tragedies, especially when there are squatters inside." The words weren't a suggestion, they were a promise, a death sentence, delivered with a smile. He didn't wait for a reply. He simply straightened up, the mask of the pleasant old gentleman settling back onto his features as if it had never left. He gave her a short, sharp nod, a gesture of dismissal, not farewell. "You have 24 hours to consider my offer. I'll be in touch." He turned and walked back to his gleaming black car, his cane leaving neat, precise holes in the dirt. The car door closed with the same soft, expensive click. The powerful engine turned over, roaring to life and shattering the natural peace of the hollow. He reversed in a neat, controlled arc and drove away, the sound of his engine slowly fading until it was swallowed once more by the chirping of insects and the rustling of leaves. Eleanor was left standing in a silence that was now profoundly different. It was no longer a silence of isolation or decay. It was the silence of a hunting ground. After the predator has announced its presence, what would you do in Eleanor's place? Would you take the $20,000 and run, ensuring your children's immediate safety, but letting a murderer win? Or would you hold on to the secret, risking everything for a justice you never asked for? The silence Thompson left behind was more terrifying than his words. It was a vacuum, sucking all the air and hope from the hollow. Eleanor stood frozen, the man's final threat echoing in her ears, a promise that coiled around her heart like a cold snake. Catching fire by accident. The phrase was a death sentence. She felt the rough canvas of the bag on her shoulder, the hard edges of the diary and documents pressing into her skin. They were no longer a historical curiosity. They were the reason her children might die. A wave of dizziness washed over her, and she gripped the rotting doorframe for support, her knuckles white. The chirping of the cicadas, once a neutral sound of nature, now seemed to count down the seconds of her life. The $20,000 was a ghost, a tempting specter of a life she could have if she just agreed to let a murderer win. Her stomach churned with a mixture of terror and a new, unfamiliar feeling, a cold, hard rage that was terrifying in its intensity. She was trapped. Night fell not with a gentle fade, but like a black cloth thrown over the world. The ruin of a house transformed from a symbol of despair into a tangible trap. Every creak of the old wood, every rustle of a mouse in the walls, sent a jolt of pure adrenaline through Eleanor's veins. She huddled with Leo and Sophie in the driest corner of the main room, a thin, threadbare blanket wrapped around their shoulders. The children were silent, their small bodies tense, infected by the primal fear radiating from their mother. Leo's hand was a tight fist in hers, his young face a grim mask in the gloom. Sophie had burrowed against her side, her soft, shallow breaths the only sound in their small, terrified circle. Eleanor felt a suffocating pressure in her chest, the weight of her impossible choice: take the money and live with the shame, or defy him and die in the fire he had promised. The air was thick with the smell of mold and damp earth, the scent of their own grave. She was failing them again, failing them on a scale she had never imagined. Her mind was a frantic race, every potential path leading to a cliff. If she stayed, they would come for them. If she ran, where could she go? She was a ghost in this county, with no money, no allies, no one. The town, Dawson's Hollow, was 4 miles of dark, empty road away. Walking there in the pitch black with 2 small children felt like just another form of suicide. What if Thompson's men were already out there, watching the road, waiting for her to break? The paranoia was a living thing, crawling on her skin, making her flinch at every gust of wind that moaned through the broken windows. She felt utterly, completely alone. Her desperate gamble on this house had not led to a home, but to a confrontation with a powerful evil she couldn't comprehend. She clutched the bag with the diary, its contents a curse. The story of Arthur Vance was no longer his alone. She had read it. Now, it was hers, and it was going to get them all killed. The weight was unbearable. With a surge of frantic energy, she knew she couldn't just wait for them to come. There had to be another way, an ally. She remembered the diary. Arthur hadn't been entirely alone. She fumbled for the cheap plastic flashlight, her hands shaking so badly she dropped it twice. The weak yellow beam finally flickered on, trembling across the room. She pulled the leather-bound book from her bag, its pages whispering as she frantically flipped through them, searching for a name, a location, anything. Her eyes scanned the tight, faded script, her heart pounding in her ears. She ignored the passages about politics and persecution, looking only for connections, for friends. And then she found it, a simple entry from the last week of Arthur's life. Sent word with A at the post office. He is the only one who knows the truth of this, the only one I trust. The post office. Mr. Abernathy. That was his name. He was a retired postman. The bus driver had mentioned him. A tiny, fragile seed of a plan began to form. Just as the name solidified in her mind, a low rumble began, a sound that vibrated through the floorboards and up her spine. It wasn't a car, it was the sky. The wind, which had been a low moan, began to rise in pitch, shrieking through the gaping holes in the roof. The trees outside began to thrash, their branches scraping against the sides of the house like skeletal fingers. A deep, profound darkness swallowed what little moonlight there was. Then, the first fat drops of rain began to fall, each one striking the dusty floor with a distinct hiss. The sound grew from a sporadic tapping to a deafening roar as the heavens opened up. An Appalachian thunderstorm had descended upon the hollow with biblical fury. Rain poured in streams through the collapsed ceiling, turning the debris-strewn floor into a landscape of dark, spreading puddles. The old house groaned and shuddered under the assault, a wounded beast crying out in its death throes. The storm was a wall, trapping them inside. Through the cacophony of the wind and rain, a new sound fought its way to her ears. It was a sound that made her blood run cold, the strained, guttural growl of a heavy engine grinding its way up the now muddy road. Her heart stopped. It was too soon. It wasn't even midnight. Thompson hadn't waited. He was impatient. A wave of pure animal terror washed over her, so intense it almost made her vomit. She scrambled to the front window, peering through the rain-lashed darkness. Two piercing beams of light cut through the deluge, bouncing and swaying as the vehicle navigated the treacherous path. They weren't just passing, they were coming for the house. The truck, a big, dark pickup, skidded to a halt in the overgrown yard, its headlights sweeping across the front of the ruin, illuminating the interior in a sudden, brutal flood of white light. Eleanor and her children were caught in the glare like cornered animals, exposed and helpless. Then, two doors slammed shut. The sound was like a pair of gunshots. "The back room, now!" Eleanor's voice was a choked, desperate hiss. She didn't have to explain. The terror was a shared language. She shoved Leo and Sophie ahead of her, away from the front of the house, their small feet slipping on the wet floor. They stumbled into the darkest part of the ruin, a small back room that might have once been a pantry. It smelled of rat droppings and ancient dust. Just as they pressed themselves against the far wall, a thunderous crash from the front of the house rocked the entire structure. It was the sound of the front door being kicked in, of splintering wood and tortured metal. Heavy, thudding footsteps stomped into the house. "Find them!" a rough voice bellowed, barely audible over the howl of the storm. "Thompson wants the papers. He wants the woman." The voice was raw, brutal, and filled with a greedy violence. Eleanor clapped a hand over Sophie's mouth to stifle a whimper, her own body trembling uncontrollably. They were inside. The beams from two powerful flashlights sliced through the interior darkness, erratic and predatory. The men moved with a terrifying purpose, not searching so much as destroying. The sound of them kicking apart the remaining furniture, of splintered wood and shattering glass, was punctuated by their grunts and curses. "Check the cellar! The old man always hid things in the damn cellar," one of them shouted. Eleanor could hear the heavy scrape of the cellar door being dragged open. This was it. Her mind went eerily calm, a tiny island of clarity in a sea of panic. The cellar was their distraction. It was a precious handful of seconds. She grabbed Leo's arm, her grip like iron. "The window," she mouthed, pointing to the empty frame at the back of the small room. It was their only way out. A fall into the muddy darkness, into the heart of the storm. It wasn't a choice. It was the only move left on the board. A wave of nausea hit her as she heard one of the men shout in frustration from the cellar. She didn't hesitate. She practically threw Leo towards the window. "Go!" she urged. He scrambled through the opening, his small form disappearing into the black on rain-swept night. Sophie was next, crying silently, her body shaking with sobs. Eleanor lifted her and pushed her through into Leo's waiting arms. Then, just as she heard heavy footsteps coming back up the cellar stairs, she pulled herself through the jagged opening. A sharp piece of remaining glass tore a long, deep gash in her forearm, the pain hot and immediate, but she barely registered it. She landed on her hands and knees in a pool of cold and thick mud. The cold shock of the rain was absolute, instantly soaking her thin clothes, plastering her hair to her face. Behind her, inside the house, an enraged yell echoed. "They're gone! Out the back!" The flashlight beams appeared in the window she had just escaped from. The hunt had begun. She had seconds to spare before they were on her. Without a second thought, Eleanor grabbed her children's hands and plunged into the absolute darkness of the woods. The civilized boundary of the yard vanished, and they were swallowed by the wild, untamed forest. The roar of the storm was all-encompassing, a physical wall of sound that vibrated in her bones. The ground beneath her feet was a treacherous, sucking mire of mud and decaying leaves. She couldn't see a thing, running purely by instinct, away from the house, away from the lights. Thorny vines clawed at her clothes and skin, ripping and tearing. A low-hanging branch struck her hard across the cheek, the impact stunning her, but she didn't stop. Her only reality was the two small, cold hands she gripped in her own, and the terror that propelled her forward. Behind them, the powerful flashlight beams began to slice through the woods, dancing erratically between the thrashing trees. They were coming, fast. The sound of their crashing pursuit was terrifyingly close. The forest at night in a storm was a living nightmare. Every step was a gamble. Her feet slipped, and she went down hard, her knee striking a hidden rock. A cry of pain escaped her lips, but she choked it back, scrambling up, mud covering her from head to toe. Leo was a silent, grim shadow beside her, pulling Sophie along, his small face set with a terrifying, adult determination. Sophie was openly weeping now, her sobs lost in the howl of the wind. "I can't, Mommy, I can't," she wailed. "We have to, sweetie. We have to run." Eleanor screamed back over the storm, her voice raw. The flashlight beams behind them seemed to be splitting up, trying to flank them. The men's shouts were clearer now, ugly and filled with curses. They were hunters, and she and her children were the prey. The bag containing the diary and the documents banged against her hip with every frantic stride, a constant, heavy reminder of what was at stake. It was Arthur's legacy. It was her family's only chance. Her lungs felt like they were on fire, each breath a ragged, tearing gasp that sucked in cold, wet air. Her muscles screamed in protest, her legs turning to lead. Every instinct told her to stop, to collapse, to give up. But the image of Thompson's cold, dead eyes and the sound of his henchmen's brutal voices spurred her on. She was no longer just a seamstress, a widow, a victim of poverty. She was a mother protecting her young, a primal force fueled by adrenaline and terror. She didn't know where she was going, only that it was away from the lights, away from the house. She stumbled on, dragging her sobbing children through the maelstrom, her only guide the faint memory of a name whispered from a 50-year-old diary, Abernathy Dawson's Hollow. It was a destination that felt impossibly far, a mythical safe harbor on the other side of an ocean of stormy darkness and imminent, violent death. The hunt was on, and the woods had no place left to hide. They burst from the tree line like frantic animals, gasping, covered in mud and blood. The storm was a physical entity, trying to beat them back into the darkness of the woods. Eleanor's lungs burned, a raw fire in her chest, and the gash on her arm throbbed in time with her frantic heartbeat. She could still hear the men's curses carried on the wind, a terrifying echo that pushed her forward. Then she saw it. Through the torrential rain, a single, warm yellow light glowed in the distance. A tiny island of hope in an ocean of black chaos. It was a house. It had to be his house. The sight sent a surge of desperate energy through her exhausted limbs. "Almost there," she screamed to her children, her voice nearly swallowed by the gale. Leo stumbled, but she hauled him up, her grip like iron. Sophie's small hand was a block of ice in her own. The mud sucked at their feet, each step a monumental effort, but the light was a magnet, pulling them out of the nightmare and toward the fragile promise of sanctuary. This was the final sprint in a race for their lives. Her fists hammered against the solid oak door, the sound a frantic, desperate drumbeat against the roar of the storm. "Please, help us, please," she screamed, her voice breaking into a raw sob. She could feel the vibrations of her own panicked blows through the wood. For a terrifying second, there was no response, and the cold dread of being too late washed over her. Then a bolt scraped on the other side, a loud, metallic sound of safety. The door swung inward, spilling warm, golden light onto the rain-lashed porch. A man stood there, tall and gaunt, his face a roadmap of wrinkles, his eyes wide with shock. It was Mr. Abernathy. He stared at the trio of half-drowned, terrified creatures on his doorstep, his gaze falling on the diary clutched in Eleanor's hand. He didn't ask questions. He simply stepped back, his expression shifting from shock to a deep, sorrowful understanding. "Get inside," he said, his voice a low, steady rumble. The smell of his home, dry paper, pipe tobacco and warm wood smoke, enveloped them. A scent so comforting and safe it almost made Eleanor collapse. Inside, the warmth was a painful shock to their frozen bodies. Eleanor's teeth chattered uncontrollably as she tried to speak, the words tumbling out in a broken, incoherent torrent. "Thompson, he knows. The house, the gold." She thrust the mud-stained bag at him. "The diary. He sent men. Mr. Abernathy took the bag with hands that were surprisingly steady for his age. He pulled out the leather-bound book, his face a mask of solemn reverence. He wiped a smudge of mud from the cover with his thumb, his movements slow and deliberate. When he opened it to the first page and saw Arthur Vance's familiar slanted script, a low guttural sound of grief escaped his throat. His eyes, sharp and clear despite his years, filled with tears that he did not try to hide. "Arthur," he whispered, the name a ghost on his lips. "I told him it would end this way." He looked at Eleanor, the shared grief and danger forging an instant, unbreakable bond between them. "I am the A he wrote of," he said softly, confirming her desperate hope. "I am the only one left who knows." "There isn't much time," Abernathy said, his voice now devoid of sorrow and filled with a steely resolve. He guided them quickly through his cluttered living room, past towering stacks of books and neatly bundled newspapers, into a small back room. The air here was different, charged with a faint hum and the distinct, clean smell of ozone. Against one wall, on a heavy wooden desk, sat a massive, complex piece of equipment, its dark metal face covered in glowing dials and switches. It was a ham radio, an antique, but meticulously maintained. "They cut the phone lines to this hollow years ago," he explained, his fingers already flying across the controls. "Thompson likes his privacy, his control, but he never thought about this." He flipped a switch, and the radio came to life with a loud crackle and hiss, the warm glow of its vacuum tubes illuminating his concentrated face. The sound was a beacon of defiance against the storm raging outside. He picked up a microphone, the storm and the static of the airwaves merging into a single roar of uncertainty. His hunt for a signal had begun. "Kilo Charlie 3, November Juliet. Papa," Abernathy spoke into the microphone, his voice sharp and clear, cutting through the static. "Calling N3DC. Come in, David. This is your Uncle Samuel. Do you read? Over." The only reply was the hiss and crackle of the storm-tossed airwaves. Eleanor held her breath, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Leo and Sophie huddled by the door, watching the glowing dials as if they were magic. Abernathy repeated the call, his voice unwavering. "Calling N3DC. This is an emergency. I repeat, this is an emergency. Respond." And then, through the noise, a voice emerged, faint and distorted. Samuel, is that you? Your signal is weak. Abernathy leaned into the mic, his words now a rapid-fire burst of information. David, listen to me. I have Eleanor Vance. She found Arthur's cash. The gold, the papers, everything. Thompson tried to kill her tonight. I have the evidence. We need federal intervention. Now. There was a pause, and when the voice returned, it was stripped of all familial warmth, replaced by the cold, clear authority of a Department of Justice attorney. Understood. Do not move. Bar the doors. Help is coming. Acknowledge. Dawn broke, grey and exhausted, over a landscape washed clean by the storm. The silence that followed the tempest was profound, but it didn't last. It was broken by a new sound, a rhythmic, mechanical chopping that grew steadily louder. Eleanor looked out Abernathy's window and saw them. 2 black helicopters, unmarked, sweeping low over the valley, their rotors churning the misty air. Then came the vehicles, a convoy of black SUVs, their tinted windows reflecting the pale morning light, moved with silent, terrifying efficiency up the Hollow's main road. They didn't stop at the ruin. They swept past it, their destination clear. At his sprawling, opulent estate on the far ridge, Marcus Thompson was likely sitting down to breakfast, confident his problem had been solved. He never saw them coming. Agents, clad in black tactical gear, swarmed the property with disciplined speed. The front door was breached. Through a pair of powerful binoculars Abernathy owned, Eleanor saw the moment Thompson was brought out, his face a mask of utter disbelief and incandescent rage. The sharp, definitive click of handcuffs being locked echoed across the valley. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of surreal activity. Flown to Washington, D.C. under federal protection, Eleanor found her voice. In a quiet, secure room, she recounted her story, her testimony, the living thread that tied together the disparate pieces of a 50-year-old crime. The diary was authenticated by handwriting experts, its faded pages telling Arthur's story in a voice that could no longer be silenced. The FBI documents, copies that Arthur had risked his life to make, were a bombshell, exposing a web of Cold War-era corruption that led to the reopening of a dozen cold cases. The story exploded into the national news. Eleanor, the desperate widow from a grimy apartment, became the unlikely hero who had unearthed a forgotten chapter of American history. At his trial, Marcus Thompson, stripped of his power and wealth, was a bitter, snarling old man. The evidence was irrefutable. Convicted of kidnapping, conspiracy, and the murder of Arthur Vance, he was sentenced to spend the rest of his life in a maximum security prison, his legacy reduced to a cautionary tale of hubris and cruelty. The final piece of the puzzle was the gold, the hoard. Valued at a sum that Eleanor couldn't even comprehend, was held in federal custody. It had no legal heirs. The European families who had provided it were ghosts, their lineages erased by war. It was treasure born of tragedy, a rescue fund whose original purpose had expired. A special federal court was convened to determine its fate. Abernathy's nephew, David, argued on Eleanor's behalf. He didn't argue for a reward, but for justice. He portrayed her not as a treasure hunter, but as the final instrument in Arthur Vance's long-delayed plan. In a landmark ruling, the judge declared that, given the unique historical context and Eleanor's instrumental role in bringing a murderer to justice, she was to be declared the legal finder and granted full possession of the fortune. The gavel fell with a final, definitive crack. Eleanor sat stunned, the words echoing in a mind that still remembered the soul-crushing weight of having only $200. A wave of lightheadedness washed over her as the crushing pressure on her chest, a weight she had carried for years, finally, miraculously, dissolved. 1 year later, the sound was not of wind whistling through gaping holes, but of a fire crackling merrily in a newly built stone fireplace. The scent was not of mold and decay, but of fresh paint, lemon polish, and the rich aroma of roasting chicken from a state-of-the-art kitchen. The house on the hill was no longer a ruin. It was a home, beautifully restored, with warm lights glowing in every window. Eleanor sat at a long, polished dining table, not frantically sewing for pennies, but watching Sophie draw a rainbow with a sprawling set of new-colored pencils. Leo sat beside her, no longer a grim-faced little man, but a boy again. excitedly explaining a science project from his new school. The ghosts were gone. In their place was peace. The cellar door was sealed, but the house's history was honored. With a portion of the fortune, Eleanor had established the Vance Foundation, dedicated to supporting artists and writers facing persecution. She had transformed Arthur Vance's tomb into a living legacy, and her own despair into a future filled with light and purpose. She stood at a large picture window, a cup of hot coffee warming her hands, and looked out at the peaceful hollow. The woods that had once been a labyrinth of terror were now a beautiful, serene backdrop to her new life. The faint, silvery scar on her forearm was the only physical reminder of the night she had run through them, a testament to her flight and her fight. She thought of the woman she had been, counting coins on a wobbly table, her heart a tight knot of fear, and felt a profound sense of gratitude that was so immense it felt like a prayer. She had been given not just a fortune, but a second chance at life itself, for her and her children. The house was not just a home, it was a symbol of her own resilience, a monument to the fact that even in the deepest, darkest ruins, hope could be rediscovered, and justice, however delayed, could eventually find the light. Eleanor's story is a testament to a mother's fierce love and the enduring power of courage. If you were moved by her journey from absolute despair to ultimate redemption, subscribe to our channel for more incredible stories of survival that will stay with you long after they end.